The seat was empty. Harriet Finley stared at it from the doorway of the Caldwell Springs Community Hall, her breath coming in short, ragged pulls. Her fingers curled so tightly around the envelope in her hand that the paper had long since surrendered its crisp edges and gone soft and damp against her palm. The chair, the second one from the left on the fourth row, pressed close to the aisle, had a single folded cloth draped over its back. A pale blue cloth. The same pale blue cloth that had been there every Sunday morning for the past 3 months, every town meeting for the past 4, every lecture and every gathering and every single occasion when Caldwell Springs saw fit to pull its citizens together under one roof. He had been saving it. For her. And now she held the proof in her shaking hand that everything she had allowed herself to feel, every small, fragile, terrifying thread of hope, she had let herself follow toward that gentle man with his quiet voice and his careful eyes, had been built on a secret so enormous it made the floor tilt beneath her boots. Deputy Henry Ralston, it turned out, had not come to Caldwell Springs by accident. The letter in her hand, unsigned, but written in a script she recognized from courthouse notices, said clearly that Henry Ralston had been sent to Caldwell Springs specifically to watch one Harriet Finley, widow, suspected of concealing information regarding the death of her late husband, Franklin Finley, whose business dealings with the Dennett Freight and Land Company had recently become the subject of a federal inquiry originating out of Abilene, Kansas. He had been assigned to her. Every seat saved, every soft good morning, every glance that had made her pulse stammer against her better judgment, it had been surveillance. Or at least, that was what the letter wanted her to believe. Harriet turned away from the door. She turned away from the blue cloth and the empty seat and the man who had not yet arrived, and she walked back out into the hard January sunlight of 1883, into the wind that smelled of frozen earth and cattle, and the particular kind of loneliness that had been her constant companion for 2 years. She had survived her husband. She had survived the shame of his death, and the debts he left behind, and the whispers that followed her down every street in this town. She had survived all of it by refusing to want anything too much. And then Henry Ralston had started saving her a seat. She had let herself want that. She had let herself want him. And now she was going to have to decide whether the letter was telling the truth, or whether someone very desperately needed her to believe that it was. The town of Caldwell Springs, Kansas, sat on the southern edge of the Kisham Trail corridor, roughly 40 miles east of Wichita, and in the year 1883 it was precisely the kind of town that could swallow a woman whole if she was not careful. It had a rail spur that connected it to the larger cattle shipping lines, a main street with 12 permanent business establishments, a church, a schoolhouse, a small courthouse that doubled as the sheriff's office, and a population of approximately 400 souls who knew every inch of each other's business and debated the remainder with creative enthusiasm. Harriet had arrived in Caldwell Springs as a bride, not by choice, but by the particular arithmetic of her circumstances in the spring of 1880. She had been 24 years old, the eldest daughter of a struggling dry goods merchant in Topeka, and Franklin Finley had been 41, broad through the shoulders, confident in a way that looked like strength from a distance, and revealed itself as something much colder up close. He had purchased a freight operation and a small house on Birch Street, and he had purchased Harriet's hand with the understanding, conveyed politely through the intermediary of her father, that the Finley name and Franklin's income would solve the debt problem that had been slowly consuming her family for years. It had not been a love story. Franklin Finley had not been a cruel man in the obvious ways. He had not raised his hand. He had not shouted. He had instead been relentlessly indifferent, a man who looked through her rather than at her, who spoke to her the way he spoke to his freight ledgers, in a tone of flat practicality that communicated exactly what he needed her to do and nothing else. In 3 years of marriage she had learned to shrink herself, to want less, to expect nothing, because expectation in that house led only to the particular pain of watching something you needed simply fail to materialize, again and again, until you stopped naming the need at all. Franklin had died in November of 1881, thrown from his horse on the road between Caldwell Springs and the Dennett Freight Relay Station 12 miles east. The coroner had ruled it an accident. The horse had been skittish, the road had been icy, and Franklin had struck his head on a stone. Simple, terrible, over. Except that 3 months after his death, a man from the Dennett Freight and Land Company had arrived at Harriet's door asking very politely whether she had any awareness of certain financial arrangements her husband had been party to. She had not. She had told the man so. He had thanked her and left, and she had stood in her small parlor on Birch Street trying to understand exactly what kind of trouble her dead husband had managed to attach her name to without ever once consulting her. She had survived that too. She had found work as a seamstress, taking in alterations and repair work from several of the families in town, and from the dry goods store owned by a solid, practical woman named Mabel Croft, who paid fairly and did not ask unnecessary questions. It was not prosperity, but it was independence, and in the bitter arithmetic of Harriet's life, independence was a luxury she had not always had. She had gradually stopped hoping for very much. Henry Ralston had ridden into Caldwell Springs in the middle of October 1882 on a gray horse with a white blaze, carrying a letter of introduction from the county sheriff's office in Wichita that appointed him as the town's second deputy. The first deputy, a man named Coles, had broken his leg in September and would not be walking freely until spring. The sheriff, a deliberate and fair-minded man named Gideon Marsh, had needed help, and Henry had come. Harriet had not noticed him immediately. She had been too busy at the time navigating a dispute with a customer over the cost of a winter coat alteration to pay attention to new arrivals on the main street. She had been aware, in the vague way one is aware of weather changes, that a new deputy had come to town. She had not been curious. The first time she actually saw Henry Ralston was at the October town meeting, where Sheriff Marsh introduced him to the assembled citizens of Caldwell Springs. He was 31 years old, lean but with the quiet solidity of a man who had worked hard most of his life, with dark brown hair worn slightly longer than the fashion, and gray eyes that moved carefully around a room before they settled. He had a way of standing still that was different from most men's stillness. It was not the stillness of boredom or impatience, but of attention, as though he was genuinely listening to everything around him and had simply learned not to perform the fact of his listening. He had spoken briefly when Sheriff Marsh introduced him. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that did not feel any need to fill silence for its own sake. He had said that he was glad to be in Caldwell Springs, that he would do his level best to serve the community fairly, and that he appreciated the welcome. Harriet had been standing near the back of the hall. She had noticed the voice, and then returned her attention to the knot of women around her who were debating whether to hold the winter social in December or push it back to January due to the unpredictability of the weather. She had not thought about him again for 2 full weeks. The first time he saved her a seat, it was at the November town meeting. Harriet had arrived a few minutes late, coming directly from Mabel Croft's shop with a coat she needed to return, and the hall was already mostly filled. She had been scanning the rows for an open chair with the slightly braced look of someone who was accustomed to not quite fitting in the available spaces, when a quiet voice to her left said, "Miss Finley, this one's free." She had looked over. The deputy, she had known him by sight by then, but they had not been introduced formally, was seated on the aisle end of the 4th row, and the chair beside him had a folded cloth across its back. His expression was straightforward. Not particularly warm in an effusive way, but not the calculating, assessing look she had been receiving from the men of Caldwell Springs ever since the Dennett Company man had paid his visit. Just a man telling her a seat was available. She had sat down. She had said thank you. He had said you're welcome. The meeting had proceeded, but something about the simple, unremarkable kindness of it had lodged itself behind her sternum in a way she could not quite dislodge, and she had thought about it that night, sewing by lamplight in her small parlor, longer than was reasonable. He had done it again at the December community lecture, a traveling naturalist speaking on the subject of Great Plains geology, and again at the December town meeting, and once on a Sunday morning when the church had been unusually full due to visiting family members of the congregation, and people had spilled into the adjacent community hall for overflow seating after the service. Every time the same cloth, the same quiet indication, the same low-voiced "you're welcome" to whatever small acknowledgment she offered. She had begun, against all the sturdy defenses she had constructed, to look for it, to look for him. She had told herself it was foolishness. She had told herself she was a 30-year-old widow with a dead husband's complicated reputation trailing her, barely making ends meet with a needle and thread, not the kind of woman whose life pivoted romantically on the attentions of a soft-spoken deputy with careful eyes. She had told herself all of these things with great conviction, and continued, despite all of it, to find the particular quality of her Sundays markedly improved if the pale blue cloth was over the back of that chair. They had spoken, over those months, in the gradual way of people who are not forcing conversation, but who are discovering that conversation does not require forcing. She had learned that he was from a small town in Missouri called Grover's Crossing, that he had been a deputy in 2 other Kansas counties before Caldwell Springs, that he had a younger sister he wrote to regularly, and that he had an opinion about the proper temperature at which coffee should be served that he held with quiet but sincere conviction. He had learned that she was from Topeka, that she sewed for a living, that she had a small but well-tended kitchen garden behind the house on Birch Street, and that she had read enough of the novels that passed through Mabel Croft's shop on their way to various households in town to have opinions about them that she had not shared with anyone in quite a long time. It had been small. It had been careful. It had been the most alive she had felt in years. And then the letter had arrived in her mail slot that morning, slipped in between a bill from the dry goods supplier and a notice about a forthcoming church collection, and the careful structure she had been quietly, secretly building inside herself had cracked straight through. Now she stood in the January wind on the main street of Caldwell Springs with the letter creasing further in her fist, and tried to decide what to do with the fact that her instincts had apparently failed her entirely, or alternatively with the fact that someone very much wanted her to think they had. She went home. The house on Birch Street was small and tended with the kind of care that comes not from abundance but from attention. She had painted the front door herself the previous spring, a deep green that she had mixed from the available pigments at the hardware store. She had put up curtains she had sewn from a remnant of good cotton. The kitchen garden was dormant now under a thin crust of January frost, but in summer it produced tomatoes and herbs and the particular satisfaction of having made something edible from bare ground. She built up the fire in the kitchen stove and put the kettle on and sat down at the table with the letter flat before her. She read it again. It was not signed. The handwriting was neat, slightly formal, the kind of hand that was common among men who had some education but not a great deal of it. The language was careful in a way that struck her, now that the first shock had worn down to something more manageable, as calculated. Whoever had written it had chosen each word to produce maximum impact, suspected of concealing information, assigned to watch, specifically sent. Every one of those phrases was designed to injure. She thought about Henry Ralston's face the first time he had saved her a seat. She thought about the complete absence of calculation in it. She had spent 3 years married to a man who had used her, not cruelly but comprehensively, and she had become, over that time, extremely sensitive to the texture of being treated as a means to an end. It had a particular feeling, a smoothness that was not warmth, a courtesy that was not kindness. Franklin had been expert at it. She had not recognized it until she was fully embedded in it, but she recognized it now. She did not feel that quality in Henry Ralston. But then again, she had been wrong before. She folded the letter, tucked it into her apron pocket, poured her tea, and sat for a long time thinking. The town meeting had been set for 2 o'clock, which meant she had roughly 4 hours. She used them as she used most of her hours at her sewing table, working through a stack of alterations that needed to be completed by the end of the week. But her mind kept returning, over and over, to the choice in front of her. She could take the letter to Sheriff Marsh and say nothing to Henry at all, let the official channels determine what was true. She could confront Henry directly and watch his face while he answered. She could do nothing, which was not really doing nothing, but was rather choosing to let the letter's damage compound quietly in the dark. She was not, she had decided 2 years ago when Franklin's debts had tried to bury her, a woman who did nothing. At 1:30, she put her sewing away, changed into her better dress wool broadcloth in a deep charcoal gray, fitted at the waist, the best thing she owned, and pinned her hair with more attention than she usually gave it. It was not vanity. It was armor. She put the letter in her coat pocket and walked out the front door. The community hall was already filling when she arrived at 10 minutes before 2. She came through the door with her heart doing something complicated inside her chest and found the 4th row immediately. The pale blue cloth was there. The seat beside it was occupied by Henry Ralston, who was speaking quietly to the man on his other side about something to do with the organization of the upcoming spring cattle count. He looked up when she came through the door. His gray eyes found her immediately. She had noticed before that he always seemed to know when she entered a room, in the attentive rather than predatory way, and he nodded once, a small gesture that indicated the reserved seat, the same way he always did. She walked down the aisle and sat down. He finished his sentence with the man to his left, then turned to her. "Cold out there today," he said. "Yes," she said. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things she had come to notice about him, that he never filled silence with himself but left it open so other people could use it if they needed to. She needed it. She used it. She reached into her coat pocket and drew out the letter and held it in her lap without unfolding it. She felt more than saw him register the paper, the way his attention shifted slightly. "Someone put this in my mail slot this morning," she said, keeping her voice low and even. "It says you were sent to Caldwell Springs specifically to keep watch on me, that there's a federal inquiry and I'm a suspect in it." She was watching his face carefully. It was the whole reason she had decided to do this now, here, before the meeting started, rather than in private where she might lose her nerve. She needed to see his face when he heard the words. What she saw was not guilt. It was not the particular smoothing over of a man caught in a hidden motive. What she saw was something sharper and less comfortable than that. It was recognition, followed immediately by a controlled anger that pressed against the surface of his calm expression like a hand pressing against glass. "May I read it?" he asked, very quietly. She handed it to him. He read it. The meeting was coming to order around them, Sheriff Marsh calling for attention at the front of the room, and Henry read the letter in the settling noise of people finding their seats and conversations concluding. When he finished, he folded it along her original creases and held it in his hand for a moment, and she could see him being very deliberate about his next words. He turned to look at her, and she held his gaze without flinching, because she needed to see whatever was in it. "After the meeting," he said, "will you let me explain?" It was not a denial, it was also not a confirmation. It was a request, quiet, direct, carrying underneath it the weight of something he needed her to understand correctly, and the awareness that a community hall 2 minutes into a town meeting was not the place to do it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." The meeting lasted an hour and a half. She sat through it with her spine straight, and her hands folded in her lap, and the letter between them on the shared bench, hearing perhaps half of what was actually being said about the spring cattle count and the proposed repair of the road bridge east of town. Henry sat beside her and paid attention to the meeting with the focused quality he brought to everything, though she was aware, twice, of his glance moving to her sideways in a way that was not surveillance and was not strategy, but was simply the look of a man who is worried about what someone he cares about is thinking. Or possibly she was still misreading him. She was very tired of not being able to trust her own reading. When the meeting ended and the hall began to empty, Henry stood and turned to her with the letter in his hand. "There's a room at the courthouse I can use," he said. "It'll be private." She nodded and followed him out. The courthouse was a 5-minute walk up the main street. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and the building was quiet. Henry unlocked the side door with his key and showed her into the small room off the main corridor that was used for witness discussions and private legal consultations. A room with a table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out on the side alley, and a wood stove that had gone cold. He built the fire up quickly and efficiently and then sat down across the table from her and put the letter between them. "I'm going to tell you the truth," he said. "All of it, and then you can decide what to do with it." "Please," she said. He looked at the letter for a moment, then at her. "There is a federal inquiry into the Dennett Freight and Land Company. Has been since early 1882. Your husband's name came up because he had financial arrangements with Dennett that the inquiry has reason to believe were connected to some fraudulent land transfer activities in 3 counties. He paused. "Your name came up because you were his wife, and because after he died a company representative came to your door." "I told him I didn't know anything," she said. "I know you did," Henry said. "That was in the inquiry report. Your statement was noted." He kept his eyes on her. "When I was offered the deputy position here, the inquiry agent out of Abilene, a man named Carver, asked me to report on your general conduct and whether you appeared to have any connection to the remaining Dennett operations. A beat. I told him I'd take the position. I came here to be a deputy. That was the truth of it." She was very still. "But you did agree to report on me." "I agreed to report on whether you seemed connected to the Dennett operation," he said carefully. "I have sent 2 reports to Carver since I arrived. The first said that, in my assessment, you had no knowledge of your husband's dealings and no connection to any ongoing Dennett activity. The second said the same thing, and that in my professional opinion further surveillance of you was a waste of federal resources that could be better directed at the actual remaining Dennett principals." The room was quiet except for the growing sound of the fire and the distant noise of the street outside. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because for the first 2 months I was genuinely just doing my job, and the saving a seat was. I did that because you always came in late and I could see you looking for a space, and there was never one near the front." He stopped, ran one hand briefly over the back of his neck. "And then it stopped being just doing my job sometime around December, and I didn't know how to tell you the first part without," he stopped again, "without ruining the second part." The honesty of it was remarkable in its plainness. There was no artful framing, no careful construction designed to make himself look better than he was. He had begun the surveillance, he had ended it on her behalf, and he had kept quiet about it because he had developed feelings he did not want to compromise by admitting the original context. It was a human failure, unglamorous and real and recognizable. "Who wrote this letter?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said. "But whoever wrote it knew about Carver's request, which means it's either someone connected to the federal inquiry who wants you frightened enough to make a mistake, which makes no sense if you genuinely have nothing to hide, and I believe you don't, or it's someone connected to the Dennett operation who wants you distrustful of the law." He looked at the letter. "The Dennett principals still operating have reason to want local law enforcement compromised, or to keep a witness isolated." "I'm not a witness to anything," she said. "You might know something you don't know you know," he said, "about your husband's arrangements, something that could matter to the inquiry." She sat with this. The fire was catching fully now and the room was warming, and she was aware of the distance across the table between them feeling both very large and very small. "I want to be angry with you," she said, "about not telling me." "You have reason to be," he said. I'm not arguing that. But you ended it, she said. The surveillance. Within the first month, he said. After that I was just doing my job as deputy and trying not to be obvious about the other thing. The other thing, she said. And despite everything she felt the corners of her mouth attempt a motion that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. He was looking at her with those careful gray eyes, and there was something in them that she recognized with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, something genuine and steady and slightly desperate in the way of a person who has been keeping something back for a long time and is now completely out of fortifications. I would like, he said very quietly, to be honest with you going forward, about all of it. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the table and picked up the letter. We should find out who wrote this, she said. He exhaled slowly, and she thought she could see the shape of relief in it even though he kept his expression even. Yes, he said. We should. The investigation into the letter's origins began practically that afternoon. Henry took the paper to Sheriff Marsh, showed him the contents, and explained the Dennett inquiry context. Marsh was a careful man who did not rattle easily, and he read the letter twice, folded it, and looked at Henry with the particular expression of a man recalculating a situation he thought he had understood. You should have told me about Carver's request when you arrived, Marsh said. Yes, sir, Henry said. You're right. Going forward, this office is completely informed, Marsh said, and we find out who wrote this before they do something more dangerous than drop a letter. Henry agreed and went back to work. Harriet, for her part, spent the rest of that afternoon sitting in Mabel Croft's shop while ostensibly attending to a repair order and actually thinking very carefully about every interaction she had had with anyone connected to her late husband's business operations since his death. She had told the Dennett Company man the truth. She had known nothing of Franklin's specific arrangements. But she had seen things over 3 years of marriage that she had processed as the ordinary opacity of a man who kept his business private from his wife, documents that appeared and disappeared from his desk, meetings in the back room of his freight office that she had not been invited to, names that came up in conversation that she had not recognized. She had not thought about any of it in a deliberate, organized way because there had been no reason to, but she thought about it now. She stopped at the courthouse on her way home and knocked on the door of Sheriff Marsh's office. Both Marsh and Henry were inside, going over a map of the county. She sat down in the offered chair and told them, as clearly and completely as she could, every specific thing she could remember seeing or hearing during her marriage that had seemed odd at the time and that she had subsequently filed away and left undisturbed. It took about 40 minutes. When she finished, Henry and Marsh exchanged a look that communicated more than she could fully parse, and Marsh said, Mrs. Finley, I want to thank you. This is useful. There's a name I heard Franklin use at least 4 times, she said. Rennick. He never used a first name, but it was someone connected to the land arrangements. She could see Henry's attention sharpen at that. Rennick, he said, and she could see him placing it somewhere in an internal ledger. Does that mean something to you? She said. It might, he said. I'll need to write to Carver. She stood up. I'd like to be informed, she said, of what's happening. I'm not going to sit in that house on Birch Street and wait for someone to slip another letter in my mail slot. Marsh said, That's fair. Henry will keep you informed. She looked at Henry, who was looking at her with that combination of seriousness and something warmer underneath it. I will, he said. I promise. She walked home in the early dark of January and found that the damaged feeling of the morning had not disappeared, but had changed its quality. It was no longer the shattering kind of betrayal she had initially feared, the kind that left a person hollowed out and finished with hope. It was the more complicated hurt of learning that someone you were beginning to trust had been imperfect in a way that was human and explicable, combined with the odd, careful, fragile relief of finding that the thing you had been hoping for was not a fiction after all. He had not been deceiving her about wanting to be near her. He had only kept back one piece of the context, and he had ended the piece that required keeping back. It was not nothing, but it was something she could work with. Over the following 2 weeks, the investigation moved steadily. Henry wrote to the inquiry agent Carver in Abilene, relaying the name Rennick and several other details Harriet had provided. Carver's response arrived in 10 days. Thaddeus Rennick was a known associate of the Dennett operation who had gone to ground after the inquiry began and whose whereabouts were currently unknown. The letter sent to Harriet had been written on paper stock that was traced, through careful inquiry, to a stationery supply operation in Wichita that served, among other establishments, a small hotel where 2 men matching the general description of known Dennett associates had recently stayed. The picture that emerged was this. Rennick or someone working with him had learned about Carver's original request to Henry, possibly through a contact within the inquiry's administrative apparatus, and had used the information to attempt to drive a wedge between Harriet and the local law enforcement, on the theory that an isolated, frightened widow with no law enforcement allies was less dangerous than a widow who was cooperating openly with a deputy who had access to the inquiry. They had almost succeeded. Harriet thought about this when Henry told her, sitting in the same room in the courthouse where they had first had their honest conversation, with the fire going again and the January wind pressing against the window. "They thought I would run from you," she said. "They miscalculated," he said. "They didn't know that I'm not good at running," she said. He smiled at that, a proper smile, the kind she had seen only occasionally from him, and that she had noticed each time the way you notice something that changes the character of a familiar landscape. It changed his whole face, not dramatically, but the way a window opened slightly changes the quality of a room. "I'm glad," he said, "that you came and showed me the letter instead of the other options." "I almost didn't," she said honestly. "I almost went straight to Marsh without speaking to you at all." "Why didn't you?" She considered this carefully. "Because I wanted to see your face when you heard it," she said. "I wanted to know before any official process started what your face would do." She paused. "It did the right thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, he said, "I want to say something that I should have said before any of this happened." She waited. "When I started saving you a seat," he said, "it began because it seemed like a practical and decent thing to do for someone who was always looking for one. And then it became something I did because I wanted to. Because you were the person I wanted to be sitting next to." He kept his eyes on her. "That hasn't changed. That's not going to change because of this situation. And I want you to know that clearly and separately from the inquiry and the letter and everything else." The room was very warm from the fire. She was aware of the precise distance between them and of everything that the past 2 weeks had done to her internal landscape. "I'll tell you something, too," she said. "I stopped expecting things a long time ago, from people, from the way life arranges itself. I got very efficient at not wanting much, a beat. You were the first thing in a long time that I let myself want, and when I read that letter this morning I thought I had been foolish again." "You weren't foolish," he said. "I know that now," she said. "But I need you to know that for me, what you're talking about, it's not a small thing. I don't take it lightly, and I'm not going to be easy about it because I'm not able to be easy about things I care about. I care too much when I care at all." He looked at her steadily. "I understand that," he said. "I'm asking to earn it anyway." She looked at him for a long time in the fire-lit room. Then she said, "All right." There was no dramatic gesture, no sudden bridging of distance. It was not that kind of moment. It was quieter and more durable than that, 2 people sitting across a table in the winter, deciding to move toward each other honestly. He walked her home that evening in the cold dark, and at her front door he took her hand briefly, formally, the way a man does when he means it as a declaration rather than a habit, and she felt the warmth of it through her gloves and held onto it for a moment before she went inside. The next weeks were among the most quietly remarkable of Harriet's adult life. Henry called on her in the evenings 2 or 3 times a week, properly, knocking at the front door and sitting in the small parlor where she worked on her sewing while he talked about his day or read from whatever book or newspaper was at hand. And they had the kind of conversations she had almost forgotten were possible. Conversations that went somewhere, that cost something, that were not performances of conversation but the real thing, two people genuinely interested in each other's minds. She learned things about him that filled in the careful, quiet man she had been observing from a respectful distance for months. He had lost his father when he was 15 to a mining accident in Missouri, and he had helped his mother keep the family together for 3 years until his sister was old enough and circumstances had settled enough for him to go west. He had started in law enforcement because it was work that paid steadily and mattered directly, and he had continued in it because he found he was suited to it, not to violence, which he avoided as a first resort with a conviction that was not cowardice but principle, but to the work of maintaining the small, daily agreements that made a community possible. He had been engaged once, years before Caldwell Springs. The woman had eventually married another man, someone with more fixed roots, and Henry had not blamed her. He had been, he said, away too much and uncertain in his plans, and she had needed more certainty than he could offer at the time. "Do you have it now?" Harriet had asked carefully. He had looked at her. "I'm not uncertain about very much right now," he had said. She had taken that in and let it settle in the way good things need to settle, slowly, without rushing. She told him things, too. About Topeka and her father's shop, and the particular texture of growing up with enough, but never quite comfortably enough. Always aware of the fine edge between stability and its absence. About the 3 years with Franklin, which she described without excessive bitterness but honestly, the indifference, the shrinking, the way she had learned to make herself small. He listened to this with a quality of attention that was different from sympathy in that it did not reach for her or try to fix the past, but simply received what she was saying as true and important. "I think you have been a great deal braver than you've given yourself credit for," he said. She had not known quite what to do with that at first, because it did not match the self-assessment she had carried for years. She put it away and turned it over repeatedly over the following days, and found each time she examined it that it held up. In February, the investigation produced a significant development. A man matching Thaddeus Rennick's description was identified in a town 20 miles east called Bridger's Ford, staying at a boarding house under a false name. Sheriff Marsh sent Henry to confirm the identification and coordinate with the local law. Henry was gone for 4 days. Harriet was surprised by how much those 4 days cost her. She had become accustomed to the evenings in the parlor, to the rhythm of his presence, in a way that made his absence a palpable subtraction. She worked through her sewing pile with grim efficiency, and had a very direct internal conversation with herself about the nature of her feelings, which she had been managing carefully up to this point, but which were now insisting on being named. She was in love with him, not the soft focus, uncertain, perhaps maybe variety of feeling she had been permitting herself to acknowledge. The real thing, deeply rooted, entirely serious, with all the attendant vulnerability that implied. She sat with this for 4 days and became acquainted with it, and then put it in the place where things that were true lived and waited for him to come back. He came back on a Thursday afternoon. She heard from Mabel Croft that he had returned before she saw him herself, and she finished her working day with great discipline and walked home and was in her parlor making tea when he knocked on the door. She opened it. He was travel-dusty and tired, and his coat had dried mud from the road along the hem, and when he saw her his face did the thing that she had been thinking about for 4 days, that quiet change in quality, that slight softness that was specifically for her and that she had been cataloging unconsciously for months. "Rennick is in custody," he said. "Carver's men took him this morning. He's the one who wrote the letter." "Good," she said. "Come inside, there's tea." He came inside. They sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light, and he told her about the 4 days, and she told him about the alterations she had completed, and the argument between 2 neighboring families on Birch Street that had eventually resolved itself without requiring official intervention. And somewhere in the middle of this comfortable, ordinary exchange, she looked up from her cup and found him watching her with an expression that was not comfortable or ordinary at all, but was very clear. "I miss being here," he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell. Could you? You knocked rather quickly for a man who was just stopping by to report," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then the smile came, full and real. "I did," he said. She set her cup down. She had been thinking for 4 days about what to do with the thing she had named, and she had decided, in the Harriet Finley way of deciding things, that there was no useful purpose served by not saying it. "I am not easy about things I care for," she said. "I told you that. But I am also not interested in being cautious to the point of missing the thing entirely." She met his eyes. "I'm in love with you. I have been trying to be sensible about it for some time, and I find I've run out of sensible." He stared at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen from him before, something undone and open, stripped of the careful steadiness he normally carried. And then he stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, because sitting felt wrong for this. And he took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was its own kind of declaration. He kissed her. It was nothing like the cold calculation of her marriage, or the theatrical demonstrations of feeling she had read about in novels and been quietly skeptical of. It was warm and unhurried and entirely sincere, the kiss of a man who had wanted to do this for a very long time and was doing it now with his whole attention. When they separated, she was holding onto his coat lapel without remembering having reached for it. "I've been in love with you," he said, very quietly against her hair, "since November." "Since November," she said. "All that time." "All that time," he agreed. She laughed and felt it shake loose something that had been too tightly wound for years, and he laughed with her, standing in her kitchen in the late afternoon light of a February Thursday in 1883. The months that followed were a kind of happiness Harriet had genuinely not believed she was still capable of. It was not uncomplicated happiness. Nothing in an adult life is, but it was real and growing and grounded in the daily reality of two people who were learning each other with care and honesty. Henry courted her properly, in the manner of the time, calling on her in the evenings and escorting her to church on Sundays, and to the various community events that Caldwell Springs produced through the spring. The town noticed, of course. Caldwell Springs noticed everything. And there was the usual range of opinion, from genuine warmth to polite skepticism, to the particular variety of attention paid to a widow who had been considered safely settled into solitude and was now, inconveniently, not. Harriet handled the town's opinions the way she handled most things she could not control, by focusing on what was in front of her and declining to borrow trouble. What was in front of her was Henry, and Henry was, she was discovering, a man of surprising depth. He had opinions, carefully formed, on matters of law and justice that he held not as abstractions, but as things with real consequences for real people. And they discussed these things in the evenings with a directness she found more invigorating than any dinner party conversation she had attended in her entire prior life. He was also, she discovered, quietly funny in a way that crept up on you, not the performed humor of a man who needs to be entertaining, but the kind that emerged from a genuine observation, offered straight, and arrived with a slight delay in its effect. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the specific quality of the loneliness of her marriage, about the way she had reorganized her expectations downward so methodically that she had almost not noticed it happening, about the morning after Franklin's funeral when she had stood in the kitchen of this house and felt, beneath the grief for a man who had not loved her as she deserved, something that was not grief at all but was its strange inverse, a kind of tentative space, a potential of life that terrified and quickened her in equal measure. He received these things without softening them or trying to resolve them. He simply knew them, the way you know a person when you have been permitted to see them honestly. The federal inquiry was fully resolved by April of 1883. Thaddeus Rennick cooperated with the Abilene agents in exchange for a reduced sentence and provided the remaining information needed to close the case against the Dennett operation's senior principals. Several arrests were made in Wichita and beyond. The Dennett Freight and Land Company was formally dissolved by court order. Harriet received a formal communication from the inquiry office stating that no charges or suspicion attached to her name and that she was entirely clear of the matter. She read it at the kitchen table and then put it down and looked at the window and felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a dark past finally, completely, closing. She showed it to Henry that evening. He read it and put it down and looked at her with clear, steady eyes. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. There was a particular quality to that spring in Caldwell Springs. The grass came in greener than usual, and the cattle moving up the trail corridor were plentiful, and the town was busy and alive with the commerce and argument and celebration of a prairie community in its productive season. Harriet's garden behind the house on Birch Street came back with an enthusiasm that felt almost personal, and she planted it larger than the year before and found herself thinking, while she worked in the rich, dark soil in the early mornings, about how different the same life could feel when the interior of it had changed. She was thinking about this one morning in late April when Henry arrived at her door earlier than usual, still in his work clothes, with an expression she had learned to read as meaning he had been thinking carefully about something for a while and had come to a conclusion. "Harriet," he said. "Henry," she said, because she could tell by the quality of the single word that she needed to pay full attention. He came inside. They stood in the small entrance hall. He took her hands and held them, and she could feel the slight roughness of his palms, the working man quality of them, and she looked up at his face. "I want to marry you," he said, not as a question exactly, but not without the quality of waiting for her answer. It was stated like a fact that he was offering for her consideration rather than a petition to be granted. "I want this to be our life, permanently, properly. I want you to be my wife and I want to be your husband, and I am not interested in any version of my future that doesn't include being in the same house as you every morning and every evening." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I want that too." "Is that a yes?" he said, and she could hear the current of feeling running under the evenness of his voice. "That is absolutely a yes," she said. He exhaled, and she saw in the release of it how much he had been carrying the question. And she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her, properly held her. In the entrance hall of the house on Birch Street, with the April sunlight coming through the window, and the garden beginning outside, and the whole future rearranging itself into a shape she had genuinely not believed was available to her. They were married in June of 1883, in the Caldwell Springs church, on a Saturday morning when the prairie light was gold and horizontal through the tall windows, and the building was filled with most of the 400 souls of the town, plus a good number of people from the outlying farms and ranches who had found reasons to be in town that day. Mabel Croft, who had become perhaps the closest thing to a genuine friend Harriet had in Caldwell Springs, stood with her as her witness. Henry's younger sister, a bright, direct woman named Clara who had made the trip from Missouri on the train, and who Harriet had liked within the first 5 minutes of meeting her, sat in the front row and cried completely unself-consciously during the vows. Harriet wore a dress she had made herself over the previous 2 months from the finest wool she could afford, a deep ivory that was practical enough for a woman who believed a garment should last more than one wearing, cut well, and fitted with the skill that 2 years of professional sewing had given her. She had embroidered the collar herself with small flowers because she felt, for the first time in her adult life, like someone for whom small flowers on a collar were not an excessive act. Henry stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the aisle with an expression on his face that she would remember clearly for the rest of her life, unguarded and certain, and so entirely hers, that it made everything before it recede to the proper distance of a past that had made her who she was without needing to be who she currently was. She reached him and he took her hands and they stood facing each other while the minister spoke the words. And she said hers clearly, all of them, meaning every syllable, and he said his with the quiet solidity of a man who does not make a promise he does not intend to keep. They were married. The reception was held in the community hall, the same community hall where he had first saved her a seat, a fact not lost on either of them. There was dancing, a fiddle player from out past the eastern farms who played with enormous energy and considerable talent, and food contributed by the women of the congregation with the competitive generosity that characterized such events, and a great deal of conversation that ranged from warm to raucous as the evening wore on. Henry danced, it turned out, with a quiet competence that surprised her, not showy, but solid and attentive, his hand at her waist steady and sure. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked. "My mother," he said. "She thought it was an essential skill for a civilized person." "She was right," Harriet said. "I'll tell her you said so," he said. "She'll be pleased." At some point in the middle of the evening, Henry's sister Clara found Harriet standing briefly alone at the edge of the room and came to stand beside her, looking at the dancing. "He's been different since he came to this town," Clara said. "Even in his letters, I couldn't tell what it was at first." She glanced at Harriet. "Now I can." "What is he like in his letters?" Harriet asked, genuinely curious. "Precise," Clara said. "Henry is always precise, but since October the letters got warmer. More present." She smiled. "He wrote me once that Caldwell Springs had better community meetings than any town he'd worked in. I suspected that was not actually about the meetings." Harriet smiled. "It was not," she confirmed. Henry came looking for her then, arriving at her side with 2 cups of the extremely strong coffee that someone had produced toward the middle of the evening, and offered one to her and one to his sister, and stood between them listening, while Clara described to Harriet, with visible enjoyment, a very specific and embarrassing story about Henry at age 16, attempting to impress a girl at a church social in Grover's Crossing, Missouri, and the exact sequence of events that had followed. Henry listened to this without notable expression and then said, when Clara finished, "That story gets worse every time you tell it." "It gets more detailed," Clara said. "Which is not the same thing." Harriet laughed and leaned into her husband's side and felt the warmth of him, and the warmth of the room, and the specific incredible fact of the evening. They moved into a larger house in August, a house on the north side of town with more rooms and a proper vegetable garden space, and a stable for Henry's gray horse, and eventually a second stall that they intended to fill. Henry's status as deputy had been formalized into a longer-term appointment by Sheriff Marsh, who had decided, after the Rennick affair, that he would rather keep a deputy of Henry's caliber than lose him to some other county. Henry had asked Harriet, before accepting the longer appointment, whether she was satisfied with Caldwell Springs or whether she wanted to consider another town. She had thought about it honestly, and told him that Caldwell Springs was where she had built her life and her business, and where she knew her people, and that she would like to stay unless he had compelling reasons otherwise. He had said that Caldwell Springs suited him very well and had gone and told Marsh he was staying. Harriet continued her sewing work. She had begun, over the spring and summer, to expand beyond alterations into original garment construction, and she had enough of a reputation in the area by the fall of 1883 that she was receiving orders not just from Caldwell Springs but from 2 neighboring towns and from several of the larger ranch families in the surrounding area. She set up a proper workroom in the new house and spent her mornings there while Henry was on his shift, and found in the combination of her own work and their shared evenings the kind of complete daily life she had once decided was not for her. In the winter of 1883, she found that she was expecting their first child. She told Henry on a December evening, sitting by the fire in the large parlor of the North Side house, measuring her words carefully not because she was uncertain of her own feelings. She had worked through those over the 2 weeks since she had confirmed her suspicion, but because she wanted to see his face unmediated by expectation. She said simply, "I'm going to have a baby." His face went through a sequence of changes that would have been, on a more expressive man, loud and theatrical. On Henry it was subtle, but she could read every element of it. The first instant of absolute stillness, then the expansion of something that was relief and joy, and the slight terrified quality that accompanies great happiness when it is real. His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen from him before. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair and took her hands and held them and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and she could see him being completely present in the moment in the way he was when something mattered. "Are you well?" he asked finally. "Perfectly well," she said. "I feel extremely well, actually." "Good," he said, and then more quietly, "A baby." "A baby," she confirmed. He brought her hands up and pressed them against his face, forehead down, in a gesture that was more intimate than most gestures she had seen from him, a gesture of someone allowing themselves to be completely open in a moment, not performing the feeling but simply being inside it. She felt it move through her like light through water. "I'm very happy," he said against her hands. "I want you to know that I am fully, completely happy." "I know," she said. "I can see it." He looked up at her. Are you happy?" She looked at him, this man who had started saving her a seat before he had any reason to love her and had ended by becoming the reason she wanted a seat in her own life again. "I'm the happiest I have ever been," she said, "by a considerable distance." The pregnancy was uneventful in the main, which was the best thing that could be said of any pregnancy in 1883 Kansas. Harriet was healthy and not inclined to allow her condition to interfere substantially with her work, and she modified her sewing schedule as needed and was attended by the town's doctor, a sensible man named Whitfield who had been practicing in Caldwell Springs for 15 years and who had delivered the majority of the children of the current generation. Henry, for his part, became very thoroughly attentive in a way that was not smothering, but was constant, ensuring the stove was well stocked, appearing for meals he might otherwise have eaten at the boarding house, where the deputies kept an informal mess, reading to her in the evenings from whatever was at hand, and then falling into conversation about it. He had always been attentive, but fatherhood approaching had added a quality to it that she found, despite herself, deeply moving. The baby arrived in August of 1884. On a hot evening when the plains wind was coming straight from the south, and all the windows of the house were open. Dr. Whitfield attended, and Mabel Croft was there, and Henry was not permitted in the room by convention, but was audibly not very far away. The baby was a boy. Harriet held him in the hot August evening light and looked at his small face, furious and red and spectacular, and felt the axis of the world tip slightly in a way she had read about and never quite believed until this moment. Henry was allowed in after a period that Harriet suspected he had found extremely long. He came through the door and Mabel Croft handed him the baby and showed him the correct way to hold a small person, and Henry held his son in his large, careful hands and looked at him with an expression that was completely, absolutely unguarded in a way that made Mabel Croft discreetly exit the room to give them privacy. He looked at Harriet. "He's extraordinary," he said. "He is," she agreed. "He has your nose," Henry said. "He has your expression," she said. "He is already thinking carefully about whether to trust this situation." Henry looked at the baby, who was doing something with his face that could, charitably, be described as considered. Then he looked at Harriet. "Thomas," he said. It was the name they had discussed, for his father and for hers, a convergence they had found and liked. "Thomas," she agreed. Thomas Henry Ralston arrived in a world that was going to keep changing around him. The frontier was already beginning its transformation into something more settled. The cattle drives were continuing, but the land was filling with homesteaders, and the railroad was pulling the geography of the plains into new shapes, and the particular wild quality of the time they had been born into was already beginning to layer over into the next thing. But Caldwell Springs, in that August of 1884, was still very much itself, and Harriet and Henry were very much within it, and the small person they had made together was very much new and present and miraculous. The following years built upon themselves in the way good years do, not dramatically but solidly, each one adding something to the structure. Harriet's sewing business grew until she took on a young woman named Grace Pullman as an assistant, a detail-oriented 20-year-old from a farming family east of town who had a natural talent for fine work, and who Harriet taught with the thoroughness of a woman who knew what it meant to have a skill that made you independent. Henry was promoted in the spring of 1885 to serve as the primary deputy with expanded responsibilities across the county, as Sheriff Marsh began to consider retirement. The work was the same work, fundamentally, the maintenance of a community's agreements with itself, the careful calibration of authority and fairness, and Henry was suited to it in the bone-deep way that means a person is doing what they were built to do. They had a second child in 1886, a girl they named Alice, who arrived with considerably more opinion than her brother and expressed it at volume from the beginning. Thomas, at nearly 2, received his sister with the cautious assessment Henry had predicted he would apply to any new situation, and then, over a period of approximately 3 days, decided she was acceptable and arranged himself as her defender and companion in a way that persisted through their entire childhood. The house on the north side of town became crowded in the comfortable way of a house that is genuinely lived in. Thomas's drawings on the wall beside the kitchen door, where Harriet had put up a small space of paper for the purpose. Alice's very particular collection of interesting stones arranged on the parlor windowsill. The 2 horses in the stable and the kitchen garden that Harriet expanded every spring, and that Henry maintained with her on Saturday mornings in a ritual they had developed early and held to through the years. On the Sunday mornings when the family went to church, and then to the community events that followed, Harriet and Henry sat together in the 4th row, second from the left on the aisle. There was no pale blue cloth anymore. There was no need for it. The seat beside him was hers, had been hers for years, and the whole town knew it and they knew it, and it was one of those facts that is so thoroughly established it no longer requires any gesture to maintain it. But sometimes, when they arrived and sat down, and the noise of the filling room was all around them, and the children were settling in beside them or being dispatched with whispered instructions to sit with certain friends and behave, Henry would turn and look at her with those gray eyes, and the quality of his attention was still exactly what it had been at the first, careful, genuine, specific to her, and she would feel it in the same place she had always felt it. She had stopped hoping for very much, once. She had built a life out of small necessities and careful management of expectation, and it had been a survivable life, even occasionally a decent one, but it had been a life with a low ceiling and no particular horizon. He had offered her a seat. Not as a strategy, or only briefly as a strategy, and then much more truly as the first simple act of a man who saw her specifically, who made a small space in the world that was particularly for her, who asked nothing in return in the beginning and eventually asked only that she let him be honest with her and permit the same in return. It was such a small beginning. It had grown into this. In the fall of 1887, Sheriff Marsh retired after 22 years, and the county voted on his successor. Henry was the clear candidate and the clear winner, and Harriet sat in the community hall 4th row, second from the left on the evening the results were announced, and watched her husband receive the news with the same quiet evenness he brought to everything, and saw in the slight compression at the corners of his eyes the feeling he was containing. She took his hand. He looked at her sideways and she saw it, the gratitude, the happiness, the fullness of a life that was running in the right direction. She squeezed once and he squeezed back, and they sat that way through the remainder of the proceedings. 2 people who had found each other at the specific intersection of circumstance and character, and had chosen, every day since, to keep finding each other. Their 3rd child, another boy they named James, arrived in 1888. And by then the house on the north side had been extended by a room at the back that Henry and 2 men from town had built over the summer, and Thomas was 4 and deeply interested in horses, and already beginning to demonstrate the kind of focused, methodical character that Harriet recognized, and Henry noted with the particular satisfaction of a man seeing himself mirrored at the beginning. James was a different creature entirely from the beginning, louder than Thomas, warmer than Alice, with an immediate and comprehensive opinion about every person he encountered from approximately the age of 6 months. He learned to walk early and used the ability extensively, and the household reorganized itself around him, the way households do around a force of nature, with varying degrees of success. Harriet, watching her children grow through the late 1880s, found herself thinking sometimes about the woman she had been before all of it, the one who had stood in the cold entrance of the community hall scanning for an available seat, braced for not finding one. That woman had been capable and disciplined and had managed, through sheer force of internal organization, to keep her life in order. But she had been sealed. She had been managing, not living. The difference between managing and living was Henry. It was the space he had made for her when she came in late. Yes, literally the space and the cloth over the back of the chair. But more than that, it was the way he had looked at her when he offered it, not as a favor dispensed from a position of comfort to a person in need, but as one person seeing another person's situation and simply making it better because that was the kind of person he was, and it was the natural thing to do. She had told him this one winter evening in 1889, sitting by the fire after the children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the particular luxury of its own stillness. "You know what I think about sometimes," she said. "Tell me," he said. She told him, the woman at the door, the scanning for seats, the braced against not finding quality of that posture that she had carried through most of her marriage and continued to carry afterward, the fundamental posture of a person who has learned not to count on room being made for them. He listened all the way through. Then he said very quietly, "I'm glad there was a seat available." She laughed. "That is the least dramatic way you could have responded to that." "I mean it, though," he said. "Not because of what came after, though obviously I'm extremely glad about what came after, but because you deserved a seat. You always deserved a seat. Someone should have been saving you one long before I thought of it." She looked at him across the hearth, this man who was her husband and the father of her children, and the person she talked to about everything, and the person whose face was the first thing she wanted to see each morning and the best thing she saw each day, and she felt the love for him as a physical fact, solid and warm and entirely without ambiguity. "You were the right person to do it," she said. He held her gaze in the firelight for a moment, then reached across and took her hand the way he had taken it at her door on the night of the inquiry resolution, the way he had first taken it after the November meeting, deliberate and present. He turned it over and pressed her palm flat against his, looking down at their hands together. "Harriet," he said. "Henry," she said. "I love you," he said, the way he said it when he wanted it to land cleanly, without decoration, as a simple and absolute fact. "I love you," she said back the same way. They sat that way for a while, in the quiet house in the winter of 1889, in Caldwell Springs, Kansas, in the life they had built together from a saved seat, and a letter and a courthouse room, and the decision, made by both of them at different moments, but arriving at the same place, that honesty was the only foundation worth building on. Outside, the plains extended in every direction under the winter sky, that enormous sky that was the defining feature of this landscape, that sky under which people had always been small and temporary, and doing their best with what they had. Inside the house on the north side of town, 3 children slept in their beds and 2 horses stood in the stable, and the garden was under its frost waiting for spring, and a woman who had once sealed herself against wanting was wanted thoroughly and completely and knew it, and held it like the irreplaceable thing it was. She had stopped hoping for much. And then a soft-spoken deputy had started saving her a seat. And the world had rearranged itself around that single quiet act of care into something she had not dared to imagine. Thomas grew into a solemn, capable boy who was at his happiest with horses and later became a well-regarded horse trader in southern Kansas, a profession that his parents found perfectly suited to his particular combination of patience and keen observation. He married a woman from a ranch family in 1905 and named his first son Henry after his father, a gesture that reduced Henry Ralston to a silence that lasted nearly a full minute and that Harriet noted and catalogued with tender precision. Alice grew into a woman with her grandmother Croft's practical business sense and her father's careful reading of people, and she opened a millinery shop in Wichita in 1906 that did extremely well. She was the child who called home most frequently and who could always be counted upon to arrive at holidays with something she had made, a hat or a decorated paper or some clever small production, and who could reduce her father to a helpless expression of pure affection simply by walking through the door. James remained the force of nature he had been since approximately the age of 6 months, and grew into a lawyer, which was perhaps the only profession that could productively absorb his volume of opinion and his fascination with the rules by which people agreed to live together. He practiced in Caldwell Springs for a time and then in Wichita, and he had his mother's needle-sharp accuracy about people and his father's underlying conviction that most disputes were resolvable if approached with sufficient patience and honesty. Henry served as sheriff of the county until 1901, 18 years in the role, and then stepped back to serve as a justice of the peace in Caldwell Springs, a position with fewer demands on his time and body and more opportunity for the precise, careful kind of judgment he had always been best at. He and Harriet stayed in the house on the north side, which by then had been extended further, repainted twice, and become so thoroughly the physical expression of their life together that she could not imagine it belonging to anyone else. Mabel Croft died in 1895 and left her shop to the young woman Grace Pullman, who had continued to work with Harriet for years, and who ran it with exactly the fair, no-nonsense quality that Mabel would have approved of. Harriet attended the funeral and held Mabel's surviving sister's hand, and felt the loss of a woman who had given her work and dignity and fair pay in the years when she had needed all three without anyone making much of it. She and Henry visited the cemetery together after, as they often did on Sunday afternoons, and stood for a while in the quiet. "She was a good woman," Henry said. "She was," Harriet agreed. "She gave me space when I needed it and work when I needed that, and she never once asked me to be grateful in a way that cost anything." "That's a rare combination," he said. "It is," she said. He took her hand in the way he always took her hand, deliberate and warm. The October light was moving through the elms that had grown tall around the cemetery fence over the years, and the town was quiet on the far side of the hill, and the long, wild quality of the frontier that had surrounded this place when they arrived had settled gradually into something more domesticated without losing, not entirely, the vast light and space that had always been the essential character of the country. They were in their 40s by then. He was 44 and she was 42, and the years had moved through them in the way years do, adding complexity and depth without erasing what had been there before. He still had the careful gray eyes and the unhurried voice and the quality of stillness that meant attention rather than absence, and she still had the particular set of her spine that was not rigidity but was readiness, the posture of a woman who had learned to stand straight in circumstances that tried to bend her. They had earned each other, was the truest way to say it, not in the transactional sense of Franklin's world, where everything was a ledger entry. In the sense of two people who had come to each other with their full, honest histories, and had not flinched from what they found, and had built something that was bigger and more durable than either of them alone would have been. On their 20th anniversary in June of 1903, the town of Caldwell Springs arranged a small celebration, organized by Alice with assistance from Grace Pullman and several of the women of the church, in the community hall. It was a Tuesday evening, and the hall was full of people they had known for 20 years, and there was food and music, and the particular warmth of a community gathering where the occasion is genuinely shared. At some point in the evening, Thomas stood up and made a toast, the words of which were so direct and so sincere that they were recognizably his father's son. He said that his parents had taught him, not through instruction but through the daily example of how they lived, that honesty and steadiness and the willingness to make room for another person were the whole of what a good life required, and that this had turned out in his experience to be completely accurate. Alice cried and told him he was the best for that, and James said something complimentary that was also somehow slightly legal in its precision, and Henry and Harriet sat beside each other in the front row of chairs that had been arranged for the occasion, and Harriet felt her husband's hand find hers under the cover of the table and hold on. She looked at him. He was looking at their children with the expression she knew, that deep, quiet, comprehensive feeling that had no need to be any louder than it was. And then he turned and looked at her, and it was the same look it had always been, the look that was specifically for her, that had not changed in 20 years or dimmed in 20 years, but had deepened in the way that things deepen when they are real and maintained. She thought about the door of the hall, that January morning, and the letter in her hand, and the choice she had made to walk down the aisle and sit beside him and hand him the paper and ask him to explain himself. She thought about all the ways it could have gone differently. She thought about the pale blue cloth and the simple fact of a seat kept open. "I'm very glad you saved me a seat," she said quietly under the noise of the hall. He heard her. He always heard her. "I'm very glad you sat in it," he said. She leaned into his shoulder the way she had leaned into the certainty of him for 20 years, the way she intended to lean into it for the rest of her life. And the hall was full of light and people, and the laughter of their children and the music of a fiddle played well. And outside, the Kansas sky went on forever in every direction, enormous and full of stars, over the town that had been her smallest hope and had become, against all reasonable expectation, her whole and happy life.